This short video will explain Frege's first puzzle. In order to understand the puzzle, you need a little bit of background. We'll look at four sort of bits of background. First up is a principle called the indiscernibility of identicals. And indiscernible here just means that you can't tell things apart. So discernible means you can tell them apart. Indiscernible means you can't. And identicals just means literally the same as. So indiscernibility of identicals, basically the name says it all. It says you can't tell things apart when there is just one thing there. So you can't tell A and B apart if A and B are just the same thing. This is sometimes called Leibniz's law. That label gets used for all sorts of things, so I'm just going to put LL there, but refer to it as the indiscernibility of identicals. So here's what the principle says a little more formally. For any two things, X and Y, if those two things, X and Y, are really identical, so if they just are the same thing, then if one of them has a feature, then the other one must have the same feature. So if two things are identical, then any feature had by one is had by the other as well. Consider an example. If Superman and Clark Kent are identical, then if Superman has the feature of being able to fly, then Clark Kent also has the feature of being able to fly. And if Clark Kent has the feature of wearing glasses sometimes, then Superman also has the feature of wearing glasses sometimes. Now, you might say, well, I don't think Clark Kent can fly, and I don't think, even once you know that in some sense they're the same person, you might say, I don't think Clark Kent can fly, and I don't think Superman ever wears glasses. And if you say that, then you're denying that they're identical. That's what this principle says. Okay. Next up, cognitive significance. The basic idea here is that some statements are meaningful or significant or important or potentially informative to your mind. So cognitive significance is like it can be informative to you. So for any declarative sentence S is cognitively significant if and only if someone who understands that sentence and is thinking clearly can doubt that it's true. So why do I frame this in terms of doubt? Think about it like this. If a statement is not cognitively significant, if it's cognitively insignificant, if it cannot possibly be informative to you, then it is something that you can't doubt. That's the idea. So for example, Superman is Superman, presumably is something that you can't doubt, and correspondingly is something that can't be informative, is cognitively insignificant. By contrast, Superman is Clark Kent is something that is potentially informative. Even if you happen to know it, it's the kind of thing that someone might not know. It's possible for you to doubt that it's true. Next up is the truth conditional theory of meaning. And this requires that you understand what truth conditions are. Truth conditions are a feature of statements or uttered sentences. The truth conditions for a statement just tell you the conditions under which that statement is true. So the truth condition for the statement, my sister is in the room, is that my sister is in the room. The truth condition for the statement, my dog's fur is brindle, is that my dog's fur is brindle. Now, truth conditions in principle can be more informative than that. So the truth conditions for my sister is in the room might be my female sibling is in the room. So they don't have to be exactly identical to the statement. But the truth conditions for a statement like Schnee is weiß and snow is white, said in different languages, can be given the same way. You can say snow is white is the truth condition for either of those. The point is, truth conditions in principle can be informative, but for our purposes, you just need to know that the truth conditions for a statement just lay down the conditions in which it's true. And typically what you can do is just take that statement and identify the corresponding proposition, which will have the same exact expression. Okay, so the driving idea here is that meaning and truth are closely tied together. You can think of the theory as saying two things. First, for any declarative sentence S, the meaning of S determines its truth conditions. And second, for any declarative sentence S, the truth conditions for that sentence determine its meaning. And to get the intuition here, the idea is like this. The truth condition for Superman flies is the same as the truth condition for Clark flies, since Clark and Superman are the same guy. And intuitively, since those two sentences are going to be true in exactly the same conditions, it makes sense to say those two sentences have the same meaning. More generally, it makes sense to say that any two sentences that are true in exactly the same conditions have the same meaning. Okay, now this will contrast with the intuitive theory of meaning. The driving idea here is that meaning and what something means to you or how it plays out in your mind or the role it plays in your cognition are closely tied together. So Here's the theory. For any declarative sentence S, the meaning of S establishes the cognitive significance of S, and for any declarative sentence S, the cognitive significance of S determines the meaning of S. And the idea here is that if you would take two sentences to mean different things, then they mean different things. And if you wouldn't take two sentences to mean different things, then they don't mean different things. There's something intuitive about that idea. So even though Superman flies and Clark flies have the same truth condition, you might think they have different meanings because I take them to mean different things. When I hear Superman flies, I think of someone in a cape without glasses flying. And when I hear Clark flies, I think of someone in a suit wearing glasses flying. So they mean something different to me, so those statements have different meaning. That's the idea. Okay. Now, we're going to identify a paradox, and the paradox will arise from a few different places, but you can think of it primarily as arising from the tension between these two different ways of thinking about meaning. So the paradox will begin with these two sentences. First, Robert Zimmerman wrote Masters of War. Second, Bob Dylan wrote Masters of War. For those of you who don't know, Bob Dylan is the stage name of Robert Zimmerman, and that person, Bob Dylan / Robert Zimmerman, did in fact write Masters of War. Okay, so now let's look at the paradox. Here's the first part of the paradox. Robert Zimmerman is identical with Bob Dylan. They're just the same guy. That's the premise. Now, from that premise, we infer via the indiscernibility of identicals, Leibniz's law, which says that any two things that are identical share all their features. We infer from the claim that Robert Zimmerman and Bob Dylan are identical that if Robert Zimmerman wrote Masters of War, then Bob Dylan did too. And if Bob Dylan wrote Masters of War, then Robert Zimmerman did too. So we infer that S1 and S2 have the same truth conditions, which is to say S1 is true if and only if S2 is true. So we start with the premise that there's just one guy there. We then add in the indiscernibility of identicals to say, if this guy has the feature of having written Masters of War, then so does this guy. And that allows us to conclude that these two sentences, S1 and S2, have the same truth value. Now we add to the claim that these two sentences have the same truth value, that any two sentences with the same truth value have the same meaning, so we add in the truth conditional theory of meaning, and we get out that these two sentences have the same meaning. Okay, now the second part of the paradox. These two sentences have different cognitive significances. Here you can just recall the overused at this point example of somebody who lives next door to Robert Zimmerman. They hate their neighbor. This person thinks Robert Zimmerman's awful. He never cleans his hedges. He's out late at night all the time. He's always loud. So he just doesn't like Robert Zimmerman. I said cleans his hedges. I meant cut his hedges. So he really hates Robert Zimmerman, but he completely loves Bob Dylan. He thinks he's the greatest American poet ever. He loves the song Masters of War. And he would be absolutely shocked to discover that Robert Zimmerman and Bob Dylan are the same person. If you said to him, Robert Zimmerman wrote Masters of War, he would say, no, that was Bob Dylan. And if you said to him, Bob Dylan wrote Masters of War, he would say, of course. If you said to him, Bob Dylan lives next door to you, he'd say, no, unfortunately, I live next door to Robert Zimmerman. You get the idea. So S1 and S2 have different cognitive significances. A rational person can accept one but doubt the other. And a rational person, can similarly doubt the identity statement, Robert Zimmerman is Bob Dylan. So these sentences, by the intuitive theory of meaning, which ties cognitive significance to meaning, so these sentences have different meanings. So now we have the conclusion that these sentences have the same meaning and this conclusion that they have different meanings. Well, that's a paradox because they can't have the same and different meanings. And when you encounter a paradox, the first thing to do is see, is it really a paradox or is it just like two things you might believe? In this case, it looks like it really is a paradox because it looks like the argument for 3 is strong, and it looks like the argument for 5 is strong. And that's when you have a paradox, when two statements that contradict one another, or at least appear to contradict one another, both are supported by good arguments. Okay, so how can you resolve a paradox? Well, in general with paradox, you have a few different options. One is to reject a premise. You can go back and say, actually, I think those guys aren't identical, or actually, I don't think those sentences have different cognitive significances. Those paths don't look very promising here. Alternatively, you can go back and reject an inference. So you can say, actually, I don't think 2 follows from 1. That doesn't look like a very promising path because in order to say that, you'd have to reject the indiscernibility of identicals, which looks pretty promising. Or you could say, I don't think 3 follows from 2. That looks more promising. There you'd reject the truth conditional theory of meaning, which, although it does look promising, seems to contradict the intuitive theory. Similarly, although rejecting 4 isn't very promising, you could reject the inference to 5 and say, I reject the intuitive theory of meaning. Again, the intuitive theory seems pretty intuitive, but since it contradicts this other intuitive theory, you might think that's a promising path. But there's a third option, and the third option is to show that what appear to be contradictory conclusions, like 3 and 5, actually aren't contradictory. And this is what Frege does. He says it looks like 3 contradicts 5, but once you sort of get clear about the notion of meaning, they don't contradict one another. So how do we get clear about the notion of meaning? Well, Frege insists that meaning is not ambiguous. His point is not that sometimes when we say meaning, we mean one thing that is captured by the truth conditional theory, and other times when we say meaning, we mean something different, which is captured by the intuitive theory. That is not his claim. Rather, his claim is that meaning itself is a complex. It has 2 parts. It has the sense part and the reference part. So when we say 3 is true up here, when we say S1 and S2 have the same meaning, we're saying they have the same reference part of their meaning. And when we say that S1 and S2 have different meanings, we're saying they have different sense parts of their meaning. And notice now these statements aren't in conflict because they're not attributing competing properties to the same thing. Where does this leave the truth conditional theory of meaning and the intuitive theory of meaning? It says basically that both of these things are going to have to be fused into a single theory of meaning. And Frege tries to do just that in his paper. Okay, so I'll stop this there and we'll move on with the rest of his paper in the next video.